Welcome to Making Your Miles Count Production, an educational program to all Canadian lease owner-operators with your host, Robert Scheper.
Robert Scheper here from Making Your Miles Count. And today we're going to look at 38 years of taxation for truck drivers on a bar chart. If you're OCD like I am, you're going to want to start at 1984 and work sequentially all the way to 2022. But the problem is it doesn't explain a whole lot of the different colors, the red and the blue. So really, we have to start August 24th, 2000. So what happened on August 24th, 2000? A court case. Don Wilkinson took Canada Revenue Agency to court to contest the $33 on the TL2. You know what that TL2 is, don't you? It's that form you get at the end of the year. You fill out how many days you've been out on the road, and then you hand it in to your accountant. Don Wilkinson asked for $40 a day when the form only allowed $33. So they went to court. Don's argument was that $33 a day was just not enough. And his evidence? Canada Revenue Agency auditors were allowed $48 a day, and they didn't have to go into the States. So the judge heard the argument between $33 per day having to go into the States and $48 per day not having to go into the States, and he was not impressed. In fact, he actually brought up a prior case that also stated the same situation in which the public was only allowed, say, something like 8 cents per kilometer for the use of their personal vehicles, and civil servants were allowed to use 35 cents per kilometer. And he said these types of aberrations should not occur. Very significant case. And the conclusion is he won the case. He was allowed to use $40 a day. So look at this chart. Why is the blue line not at 33 or 40? This comparison chart shows the difference between after-tax and after-tax. The $33 is a pre-tax number. Once that $33 goes into the income tax form and is converted into after-tax money, it's only $5.38. Now that we know where the blue line comes from, let's give a couple of minutes to this red line. Where did I get it? Well, I got the red lines from 1984 to present through a Freedom of Information Act a number of years back. And to my understanding, it's the only place in Canada that actually has a complete history of non-taxable benefits. And then I just compare it to the historical TL2 results. That's how we got the red lines. The court case with Don Wilkinson quoted $48 for auditors. This Freedom of Information Act request, the non-taxable benefits, that's where the auditors would get paid for. The problem is the numbers don't quite match to what Don Wilkinson said. He said auditors got $48 a day. The actual numbers are in 1995, there was $47.55. 1996 is $49.20. 1997 was $49.57. And 1998 was $50.85. So the number that he was quoting of $48 was actually understating what was actually going on. So there was a little bit more difference than even the court case implied. Let's take a look at this blue line over 38 years and see what actually transpired. As you can see, it's pretty much flat all the way through, and it looks flat for the first almost 20 years, but it's actually not. Dips actually a little in 1994. What happened in 1994 was the Prime Minister, Paul Martin, at the time said that some people are not paying their fair share of taxes, and he moved the 80% deductibility of meal allowance down to 50%. Now, at the same time, he did increase the amount from $22.50 per day, the gross figure, up to $33 a day, but it still created a net loss for the truck drivers. And it went from $5.87 per day down to $5.38 per day. And that $33 per day and 50% lasted, for goodness sakes, all the way to 2003. Now, there is a reason why it bumped in 2003, but we'll get back to that in a little bit. In 2003, it went from $33 a day to $45 a day. A few years later, it went from $45 a day to $51 a day in 2006. Now, that's very quick. A few jumps in there, and it has to do with some political lobbying that was going on at the time. Conservative government just came in, and there was some pushback on some meal allowances, and it has to do actually with a class action lawsuit that occurred, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes. But in 2007, 8, 9, 10, and 11, through legislation, it went from 50% deductibility, it jumped right back up to the original 80% deductibility. And then from 2012 till 2020, nothing occurred. It was everything the same, $51. And it only went from $51 to $69 when COVID or the pandemic hit, and truck drivers were so highly valued, at least in 2020. And that's pretty much the story of the 38-year span. Okay, let's take a very, very general look at the red bars over 38 years. The first thing you notice that it goes up considerably. Actually, it's 3.4 times. That's what it multiplies. From 1984 to 2022, it multiplies 3.4 times, which is significant. And you think, my goodness, that looks awfully greedy. Well, when you really look at it, though, the blue line, if you look at the numbers, 1984 to 2022, they go up 3.4 as well. So comparatively, they go up. The only problem, of course, is they both start off so incredibly different, and the net result is just exacerbates the whole situation because they started out so far apart. So let's go back to this fulcrum of 40 years of taxation, the Don Wilkinson court case. When he won, it caught the attention of Jim Park, a writer in Highway Star magazine, who wrote an article. And truck drivers all across Canada started reading this article. It spread like wildfire, and people started getting upset against Canada Revenue Agency. Long story short, a law firm from British Columbia started a class action lawsuit against Canada Revenue Agency using Don Wilkinson as the basis. The class action started to gain momentum and a lot of interest, and it didn't look very good for Canada Revenue Agency publicly, but through the courts, they were winning. To counter the class action publicity, Canada Revenue Agency in 2003 increased the $33 to $45. Notification of whether the Supreme Court was going to hear the case or not was scheduled to be announced in December 2006. Then, just weeks before the announcement by the Supreme Court, Canada Revenue Agency increased their 45 up to 51. In December 2006, Stephen Harper was just 10 months into his first term as Prime Minister when the Supreme Court denied the appeal of the class action lawsuit. This created ripples all across Canada in the trucking industry, and drivers had high expectations of some sort of rebate, some sort of compensation for their meal allowance. This aberration, if you will, was going to be rectified, and it fell flat. Almost immediately, the Canadian Trucking Alliance launched the Lunch Bag Letdown campaign that lobbied the Conservative government to move the deductibility from 50% back up to 80%. Though the campaign was successful, it spread the raise over 5 years. In March of 2007, my first book was published, showing all of the details, including the quotes from the court case itself and the difference between the red bar now and the blue bar. So the question is, why is there a red bar and a blue bar? Who started it? Did you know that prior to the 1980s, just before the beginning of this chart, there was no difference between the red bar and the blue bar because there was no blue bar? The pay structure of truck drivers in the 1970s and prior, there was everybody got paid cents per mile and also the red bar. Whatever the company paid in non-taxable benefits, you got paid two different ways. You got a check for your miles and you got a check for your meals. I remember this because when my wife and I were driving truck, we were looking around for different places to drive, and we'd ask what their rates were, and they would say, this is what we give you per mile, but that includes your meals. Because it was still very popular at the time, old school drivers would say, okay, well, you get so much per mile, but how much for your meal allowance? And it was that realization that realistically the entire industry used to be red bar. So what happened to the red bar in the trucking industry? The answer, a little bit complicated and pretty logical actually. Realistically, what happened was Canada was negotiating NAFTA. And in order to compete with the United States trucking industry, Canadian trucking companies needed an exact figure for their bids that they would have on the freight. And the problem was if you paid two different ways, sometimes you would have two very different results. You could send one person down to Texas and come back, and the person would do it in 4 days, 5 days. Whereas you'd send another guy and it could take him 7, 8 days. And when it comes to the red bar or the meal allowance, that is a per day payment and not a per mile payment. So they standardized everything all across the country, all across the industry. In my research into the non-taxable benefits or the red bar, I realized that the trucking industry is not going to bring back non-taxable benefits. Company drivers are not going to get paid like that. It's just far too risky for the industry to adopt. But there is an industry within the trucking industry that can still use it, and that is the independent operator industry. Whether you're a lease operator or an owner operator, you can still use the red bar. And that is what our accounting firm specializes in, the application of the red bar, not the TL2 blue bar. So if you're an independent operator and you want to save taxes, the most efficient way to do it is to change the system from the TL2 to the non-taxable benefit. And that you're going to need help on. You need help from an accountant. Sometimes you maybe even a lawyer. When you ask your accountant if they're going to use non-taxable benefits or they're going to use the TL2 simplified method, generally speaking, they are not going to use non-taxable benefits. And there's a reason for it. They have to be properly set up and trained for it. But most preparers of taxes for independent operators do not use this system because they don't know about this system or how to defend it to Canada Revenue Agency. And that's the biggest problem. I've talked to accountants and accounting firms all across Canada, and I ask them, are they using non-taxable benefits? It only takes me a few minutes to explain it to them, and they all understand, and invariably, they all say no. And there's a reason for it. Actually, a couple of reasons for it. Number one is liability. The liability for the accounting firm is just far too high, and the amount of accounting fees that they get from you, the independent operator, doesn't cover the liability issues. And the second thing is that is very tedious, and there's a lot of hoops to jump. It is technical in nature. It's complex. In order to fully comply to the non-taxable benefit system, it has to be, in many regards, has to be automated. There has to be technology involved in it. In Canada, there's many industries that use non-taxable benefits, but the thing that they all have in common is they generally are very large companies. And large companies can absorb this level of technology and level of complexity into interwoven with their employees, and it works quite well. And one of the reasons why the entire red line or the non-taxable benefits was never fully accepted in the open market is because it's costly to maintain. Prior to the 1980s, only a few people had computers to keep track of everything. It was all done manually before, and it was just far too cumbersome to handle. But now with the advent of technology in terms of computers and even our cell phones, there's things that we can do now that was virtually impossible for the individual or small business to do in the 80s or 90s. So let's take one final look at this data and see if we can gain a little bit more understanding of what has gone on, or maybe has not gone on. 1984 to 2022, inflation was 2.38%. If you take a look at non-taxable benefits, it actually returned 3.31%. So it did almost a whole percentage point higher than inflation. So what actually is happening here? It's supposed to travel with inflation, but it's actually outstripping it by one whole percentage point. And like we said before, there's three determinations as to what these non-taxable benefits, where do they come from? They're a combination of politicians, bureaucrats, and government unions. In that time frame, we've had considerable changes of political parties, went basically liberal, conservative, back and forth. That's sort of the Canadian way. In 1984, John Turner was Liberal Prime Minister. Then Brian Mulroney from 1984 to 1993. Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin took over 1993 to 2006. Stephen Harper 2006 to 2015, Conservative again. And Justin Trudeau 2015 to 2022. Well, as you can see, probably the biggest jump actually occurred in 1998, 1999 to 2002. That was the biggest increase, as you can see in the red bars. Maybe a little bit. Probably in second place is Justin Trudeau in 2016 when he first took over to 2018. There was a considerable jump there. But there was actually a fairly decent increase during Brian Mulroney's time period as well, basically 1987 to 1991. And probably the flattest time period where there was the least amount of increase actually occurred between 1991 or 1992 all the way till 1998 about, which the majority of that was actually Jean Chrétien, or a Liberal. So there's not 100% correlation between political parties and the non-taxable benefit increases, but there is some. I would probably say it's much more of an effect of a bureaucracy or government unions than it is actually political parties. Well, I hope this journey back in time in Canadian taxation has been helpful to you. Have a great trip.
Thanks for stopping by Making Your Miles Count. For further Making Your Miles Count productions, call us at 877-987-9787 or download us at makingyourmilescount.com.